I'd love to get a little bit more into the actual investigative techniques that you guys had to use because you really had to use a number of them. In particular, can you talk about the one survivor you got to who told you what it was like on the boats and how you got the DNA? How did you actually trace the victims?
So there's a few things there. The survivor from another shipwreck of similar but another boat was very important for us to understand what the voyage was like, because there were no survivors in the boat that we were investigating, the boat that arrived in Tobago. But this young man had survived a terrible, terrible voyage that was very similar. And the same routes, left Mauritania, but was by chance found by Spain. But he was only one of 3 survivors, and there were 63 people on his boat. And so he really gave us a sense of what it's like to be adrift and what happens, and day by day, and how people start dying progressively, and how you survive or how you don't survive. So that was really important for us to understand what the people we were trying to identify and tell their stories might have gone through. So that was one important element. The other really crucial element was a list of phone numbers that authorities in Tobago had managed to extract from one of the cell phones recovered from the boat. And for various reasons, no one had actually tried calling these numbers, and they got to our hands, and we decided we should call these numbers and see, who answers, and see if they're looking for anyone that's missing.
Yeah, these
together.
Yeah, these were contact lists, so they didn't have the number of the phone, but they had basically the contact list. So what we did was Renata literally called one by one and started across the information that she could get. And then
So explaining, we found your number in a phone on a boat. Do you know anyone that's disappeared? And then all these names would come up, and they would match. And so we in the end kind of had an idea of who the phone belonged to and who had traveled with that
and where they were from.
Yeah. And then we went there to talk to the people that we found by calling these numbers and really putting the puzzle together. But then, of course, nothing is really certain until you actually do a DNA test on one of the deceased.
And that's when we got to Tobago, so all of this was still before we got to Tobago. When we got to Tobago, we were very lucky that a police officer had still kept the evidence that they found on the boat. By some miracle, it was still there. So we basically opened every single evidence bag that was closed for almost 6 months at that time, and we photographed every item. Basically clothing, basically clothing and phones and chargers, cataloging basically every item, and then we shared that evidence with the families to see if they could recognize some of those items. And that is how we initially found a shirt. A few shirts actually, yeah. But we could cross reference.
So then we said, okay, so if this shirt belongs to this person and was found on this body is likely
to be
of that person, but only a DNA test can really confirm that. And so, it's not something journalists usually do, DNA tests. And I remember when an editor, Marjorie, suggested we do it, I thought she was, what is she talking about? But she was so right, because that was really essential to having the certainty and bringing closure to at least one family.
But basically at this point, we already had a list of possible people that board the boats, and by matching at least one DNA, we were sure that list, like that the people in our list were in fact the ones in the boat. So it was more than just one person. It was really a confirmation
confirming the group.
The group could that boat basically belong to that group? And so it was a lot of pieces from different yeah,
different areas. Just
yeah.
to clarify, so no authorities had done a DNA test before because they didn't know who to match the DNA to, right?
Yeah.
Well,
So
it's a bit more complicated than that, because if you think about it, you have families scattered between Mali, Senegal, France, and you need like parents, you need like father, mother. It's not as simple as just, you know, anyone that's related to the person. And then you have to compare it with the DNA test of the body.
And the
So
type
all
of
this is
test
very
also
bureaucratic.
has to be the same. Yeah.
Type of test. So all this is very bureaucratic and difficult to get. It's not, there's, you know, in Mali, it's not everyone that has access to a lab. It's expensive. And one of the organizations that offers this services normally is the ICRC, but even they aren't available to a lot of families, or the families struggled to get them to help at first. So then we did it through a private lab, but everything had to align for it to happen. Like this mother who was originally from Mali happened to be in Senegal, where there was a lab that we could, you know, hire and that could send a sample to Tobago. It took like months for it to get there, and chain of custody and all these things. And another few months for the authorities in Tobago to compare the DNA and you know, say whether it was a match or not. So really, really not as simple as it sounds.
But and until today, that remains the only one that was buried and
oh,
identified.
so the others still have not been identified.
Despite
Isn't that in process?
The ICRC, after our investigation, did take more samples from families on our list and sent it to authorities in Tobago. And there were matches. So I think six more bodies were identified. For some reason, they were not officially buried or identified. Families weren't given a death certificate. And again, it comes down to bureaucracy, to you know, very bureaucratic procedures, cross borders. It's not as simple as it sounds.
Talk a little bit about your source in France, Meso. How did you find her, and how did she end up being related to the boat?
So Meso was an aunt who was looking for her nephew and had posted on a social media page for missing migrants. And I found her through this social media page and this activist. And she was one of the first families that I interviewed, in the sense of people looking for their loved ones in this migration route. I didn't know at the time that it would turn out that her nephew, the nephew she was looking for, was on the boat that I was investigating. But I didn't know that initially when I first reached out to her, neither did she. And by coincidence, we later figure out that her nephew had been traveling with the group from Mauritania. Her nephew from Mali had joined the group from Mauritania and had boarded the same boat. And they were the ones that we managed to send a DNA sample of his mother to the authorities in Tobago, and he was the one that we managed to identify and bury. So she was super important, super helpful throughout the entire investigation, very cooperative, very eager to find out what had happened to her nephew, and extremely helpful. And I'm very thankful for her agreeing to take part in this story. And yeah.
Yeah, and especially at the beginning, as we said, we were not sure of many things, and a lot of people were skeptical. Especially after the first DNA tests, everything changed. People realized. I think also many didn't want to accept. They wanted to know.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing to want to know.
Yeah.
The thing is to accept. But once there was a confirmation, things changed, and everyone was actually calling Renata every day, basically asking for DNA tests and seeing if we could do and more DNA tests and so on. So they want but she was really cooperative from the beginning and really trusted us. So it was really important.